O Teatro Estúdio Fontenova preparava-se no dia 13 de janeiro para estrear pela segunda vez a Paz Perpétua, de Juan Mayorga, já que a primeira tentativa, o ano passado, foi suspensa devido ao contexto de Covid-19. Infelizmente, o mesmo não aconteceu este ano. Enquanto a estreia não acontece, propomos estas conversas online, iniciaram a semana passada para discutir tópicos relacionados com o texto. Pedimos à nossa equipa da Paz Perpétua para escolher um tema que a obra aborde, convidando assim em cada sessão um especialista a aprofundar o mesmo, tendo assim um cruzamento disciplinar entre o teatro e as outras áreas. Hoje temos connosco Peter Gelderloos. Thank you, Peter, for being with us. O Peter é um anarquista, ativista, autor de diversos livros, incluindo Como é que a não violência protege o Estado, Anarquia funciona e a duração do poder. É originalmente da Virgínia, dos Estados Unidos, mas viveu nos últimos 12 anos na Catalunha. Portanto, o Peter está aqui ao lado, é nosso vizinho, so you are our neighbor, Peter. I just introduced you, and I appreciate so much to you for being present today with us. With this book that you released, I think it's 2007, the How Nonviolent.
Yeah, the first edition was 2005, but then an actual publisher took it up in 2007. Yeah.
Okay, so this book that you released and wrote, How Nonviolence Protects the State, has many topics which are close to our perpetual peace written by Juan Mayorga, and how the state uses violence, but when it's citizens using the violence, it's already discredited. So we wanted to invite you to talk a little bit about this, also in relation to this, to our text. So how do you think this, and wanted to ask you to start a little bit into those who don't know this your work, what do you think is this paradox of nonviolence in our society? And if you have some ideas also, obviously, of relation to the perpetual peace that it might have occurred to you, that you could share with us. And thank you once again. E just to let everyone know, só para dizer a toda a gente, eu no final acabei de perguntar ao Peter um pouco sobre esta questão da não violência, do paradoxo da não violência na nossa sociedade e da relação com a paz perpétua, mas eu irei traduzir no final aquilo que o Peter disse, as principais ideias para português. So I was just letting everyone know that I will translate your main ideas into Portuguese when you finish your intervention. And you can go ahead. Thank you.
All right, thanks. So one of the main contradictions regarding nonviolence is that states govern in part through a monopoly on violent force. So when the media, when politicians, when the police all insist that when we resist, we have to be nonviolent, really what they're doing is they're maintaining state power. They're maintaining the ability of the upper classes to continue doing all of the things that impact very negatively on our lives. Also, I think that the whole emphasis on nonviolence convinces us to use a term that really does not belong to us in evaluating our movements. And that term is violence. Violence it's a moralistic category. It's a very vague word. And historically, the word violence is used more to apply to what is shocking than what is harmful. So a factory polluting our air and our water, that's very harmful. That kills a lot of people. But most people wouldn't describe it as violent. They probably don't even see it, the people who are getting affected by this pollution. But someone, going and blocking the road to that factory or sabotaging the power lines to shut the factory off, that's shocking because it's not normal. And it's not normal because it's not consistent with the oppressive society that we live in. So in a society that's patriarchal, that's based on racism and colonialism, that's based on capitalism and economic exploitation, and letting people die if they can't produce the monetary value necessary to the economy. What's shocking is anything that goes against that. So the question of what tactics and what methods we use when we resist I really don't think should be passed through the filter of violence or nonviolence. And really, anyone who trusts major media or the government to tell us what is violent and what isn't, I think is maybe a little bit naive about how the world works. I mean, at a time when with, massive unemployment, with people getting evicted, even though there's a pandemic. I don't know exactly what the situation of with healthcare is in Portugal, but in the Spanish state, for years and years, both of the major parties, the Socialist and the Conservative Party, have been chipping away, have been eroding public health care. And then that means, people die. And now in the pandemic, even more so. So the tens of thousands of people who have died here, that's a result in large part of government policies. So we shouldn't really be looking to them to tell us, to define for us what's violent, or even really using that term, just because, like I said, it's so ambiguous and moralistic. I do think that we need to evaluate how we resist, how we struggle for a better world with some kind of qualitative means as well. I don't think we should just look at, efficiency. As an anarchist, I believe that you can't separate means and ends, but I think looking at how authoritarian or how empowering a tactic or method of struggle is much more direct and useful than how violent it is. So does this method of struggle turn oppressive power relations on their head? Does it reproduce new oppressive power relations, or does it help people grow outside of those power relations? I think those are all very useful, important questions to ask, but it doesn't relate so well with the question of whether it's violent, right? So, I write with some prisoners, and then I work in solidarity with prisons and fight for the idea of a world without prisons. Torture is, of course, a major problem in prison. Someone who tortures someone else and someone who fights back against a bully, I think there's absolutely nothing in common between these two activities, and so I just don't think it's useful to put them in the same category at all. Historically, I think there's a lot of manipulation about histories of social movements, about the effectiveness of nonviolence, and one of the main reasons for that is because, in large part, we're educated about history by the state, in public schools, or by corporations that own the media, that own Hollywood in the US, or the culture industry more generally, and they decide what stories get told and how those stories get told. So I come originally from the United States. The history of Martin Luther King is quite famous, but there were many other people, many other organizations who participated in that movement, who were equally important, who did not adhere to nonviolence. So really, you have to look at that movement as presenting a diversity of methods that had a complex interrelation. So in this maybe is a bit more specific than what they teach in Portugal, but in the US, most people know the story of Birmingham, which was, taught to be like the most racist, the most segregated city in the South. And Martin Luther King and his organization went there. They made a nonviolent campaign, and then finally Birmingham desegregated, and the US government passed the Civil Rights Act. They passed a major law regarding racial equality. What they leave out of that history is that King's organization had used the same nonviolent tactics in the past and failed, but this time in Birmingham, local youth were fed up with being tortured by police, and they actually rioted. They took over the center of Birmingham, they kicked out the police, and they started burning down white businesses. And that week, Birmingham desegregated. And the same month, the US government, which had been saying, now is not the time, we can't do this, they announced their support for civil rights legislation. So the reforms that were gained, they were gained by a diversity of tactics. They weren't gained by nonviolence. And the second thing that's really important, why does the government teach us about this victory of nonviolence? On the one hand, because they want us to be nonviolent, and on the other hand, because they also want us to think that it's a victory, that racism is a thing of the past. So partial change, reform, it's important. It's not something to ignore, but obviously the goals of the anti-racist movement were not solved, as we can see by things that continue to happen in the United States today, with extreme institutional racism of the border guards, the police, police killings. And again, it was when people took the streets, fought police, and burned a police station down that the entire society in the US was forced to have this conversation about how racism continues. And even the mainstream was forced to continue this, to consider this very radical proposal of abolishing the police. The idea that the police don't exist to protect people, they exist to protect property, to protect exploitation, to protect oppression. Gandhi is an interesting figure. Just to say one thing really quick about him, he actually mobilized Indians living in South Africa to support the British in a colonial war against native South Africans, right? So Gandhi was actually comfortable supporting racist colonialism, but his big argument was to convince the British that they would have more luck convincing Hindus to support the war effort if they gave them nonviolent roles within that war effort, like medics, stretcher bearers, people carrying supplies, people doing logistics to support the war effort. So Gandhi's nonviolence actually evolved as a way of very directly finding a nonviolent way to support violent racist colonialism. This isn't just a question of examples from the past. This affects us nowadays. I mean, of course, the U.S. military and many European militaries are still killing many people and supporting occupations in Iraq and Afghanistan. In 2003, the U.S., Britain, a couple other countries were getting ready to invade Iraq, and we had the largest protests in world history. February 15th, 2003, around the world, in most countries, the protests were exclusively nonviolent. What's really interesting is that immediately after those protests, if you look at the nonviolent organizations that organized them, immediately afterwards, many of them were predicting that it would be impossible for the US to invade Iraq after that. Why did they believe that? Because with these huge peaceful protests, they thought that they were repeating the same thing that stopped the US war against Vietnam, right? So supporters of nonviolence often fall victim to their own histories. The US did not pull out of Vietnam because of a nonviolent resistance movement. First of all, in the US, there were hundreds of sabotage and bombing attacks against military infrastructure in universities and elsewhere across the country. More importantly, the US was losing control over its military, specifically as Latino and Black soldiers radicalized, being radicalized by these racial justice movements in the US, and they stopped obeying their officers. In many cases, they started killing their officers. And of course, more importantly than that, the armed resistance of the Vietnamese themselves. There was no resistance from people in the US to the war against Vietnam until Vietnamese people started fighting back. So in a very racist dynamic, supporters of nonviolence erased the history of resistance of Black and Latinos and Native soldiers, and they erased the history of resistance of Vietnamese people and the millions who died fighting first French and later US colonialism or neocolonialism. And then they try to claim that it was just people doing peaceful protests that stopped the war. And this history this falsified history has continued with us in time up till 2003, when people say that that they were going to stop the invasion through peaceful protest. And of course, it didn't happen that way. But there was not a great continuity of solidarity with people struggling in Iraq, because ideologically, psychologically, people in the global north, people in a wealthy country really had no model for creating solidarity with people who had to fight for their lives against an occupation. So the US government was very successful in helping a lot of the resistance, or at least the most visible resistance in Iraq, transition from secular and sometimes even anti-colonial formations to like fundamentalist Al-Qaeda inspired groups, which at the beginning were non-existent in Iraq. And I think the nonviolent resistance in Europe, in North America, bears some of the blame for that process. Nowadays, the whole system is falling apart. It's very difficult for anyone to pretend that capitalism works. It's gotten much harder to hide the nature of the police. In the Spanish state, particularly in Catalonia, we've had major struggles in these past weeks in a context of violent evictions of people who can't pay their rent anymore in the middle of a pandemic, and then several cases of police brutality that were caught on camera. Migrant worker camps set on fire right before the migrant workers were supposed to be paid, things like that. The state imprisons a rapper for his lyrics. And as perhaps many of you saw, the streets erupted in many cities in violent riots. And that's interesting because in some ways there's some similarity to the George Floyd rebellion in the US. Of course, the US media is terrible. There's an extremely narrow range of opinions that are allowed in US media, and it generally represents like the interests of property and the culture of commodity fetishism and adoring material things and not caring at all about life. But they realized in that moment that if in the first week they spoke out against the property destruction, if they spoke out against the rioting and the burning of the police station, that everyone in the country who wasn't just like a completely open racist would realize that the media and the police were the same thing, and they would lose their credibility. So actually for a few weeks, the media were saying, oh, okay, the property destruction is not that bad. And maybe we should have a debate about abolishing the police. And then very, very slowly they brought it back in, next by trying to claim, and this is something that a lot of pacifists do as well, that the rioting was actually caused by infiltrators. Right, so they started circulating the rumor that it was fascists infiltrating the protests to actually burn down the police station, which is not true. And then slowly restoring people's respect and property. So on a shorter timeline and less intensively, but in some similar ways, that happened here as well with the riots after the imprisonment of the rapper, that a lot of media in the first couple of days were saying, oh, maybe we should change our laws to not, imprison artists for, free speech anymore. And then early on in the protests, because obviously the police, they're legally prohibited from shooting these kind of rubber bullet munitions at people's faces. And anyone who's been in a protest in the Spanish state sees that that's pretty much all they do, right? They aim for your face and they shoot you. They try to shoot you in the face, which demonstrates about how useful laws are against those who make the laws. And they shot a person's eye out, right? And so also in the media was paying a lot of attention to, oh, maybe we need to look at, changing, the laws that govern how the police, are able to use force, or, creating some kind of police accountability, and so on and so forth. So they were pretending to entertain a debate that had to do with the violence of the state, right? Whether imprisoning people or shooting people's eyes out. But within a week, they very quickly were able to change the debate back to, those poor trash containers that are getting burned, and to try to create indignation about the destruction of things that don't have feelings, right? These are glass windows of expensive shops, right? Because there was also looting, and they tried to say, oh, this is such a shame, the looting. So, glass windows, property being stolen from extremely wealthy corporations, and dumpsters belonging to the city being set on fire. So they're placing that on a more important level than someone's eye getting shot out or someone getting locked in a cage for their song. And now they've started, arrests and raids against anarchists, and, trying to blame Italian anarchists, coming, from Italy to Spain to cause riots. It's just these absurd narratives that they've been using for more than 100 years. So nonviolence plays a role in that because it puts the focus where it doesn't belong. When we're living in a cage, whether it's a small cage like in prison or a larger cage like our society, you need to break things. You need to break submission. You need to break obedience, and you also need to break a great deal of infrastructure and physical structures, and learn how to take over the streets in order to change anything. Even if that just means like very early steps, like starting a conversation that before was impossible to have. And so the emphasis shouldn't be on violence. The emphasis should be on empowerment or on oppression, on who holds power, who basically isn't even allowed to live, who is it that makes a dignified life impossible for the rest of us. That's where the conversation needs to go. And unfortunately, this whole question of whether a trash can gets on fire is a distraction. The only relevant conversation I think that should come up in is, well, why are people doing that? People do that because it's an effective way to stop the riot police vans from driving through the street, because oftentimes they run people over as a way of, they hit people with their vans as a way to get the protest off the street. If we've accepted that we need to take the streets when they're kicking people out of their housing, when they're locking people up in cages for songs that insult the king, then absolutely, pulling dumpsters in the street and setting them on fire is that's, how is that even a question if that's like a worthy price to pay? And then, then the next step, what do you need to do to get the police off the streets so we can actually start transforming these spaces, using these as spaces of opening up a great social conversation of the world that we want to live in, of what we need. And also that way, you can directly stop evictions so that a bank that's trying to kick a family out of their house can't do it anymore because there's people in the streets and we've learned how to hold the streets. So those, I think, are much more important questions than, trying to decide if we can fit a tactic into the non-violence box or the violence box. So yeah, that's kind of in a nutshell. That's those are some of the basic arguments in my criticism of nonviolence.
Thank you, Peter. Vou traduzir agora. I will translate briefly your main ideas, just so everyone, it's more inclusive in that everyone that does not have so much knowledge of English. Então, eu vou traduzir aqui algumas das ideias muito brevemente que o Peter nos falou. Já agora o livro que ele fala, como é que a não violência protege o Estado, está traduzido para português do Brasil e vocês podem encontrá-lo online, caso queiram. Tem vários capítulos sobre como é que isto é espelhado. Pronto, mas há aqui uma questão relativamente, eu fui traduzindo à medida que ele ia falando, mas é a relação desta questão de manter o poder do Estado e de manter o poder das classes superiores que impactam as nossas. O ênfase desta não violência mantém esta questão desta manutenção de poder do Estado. E ele refere a questão da violência como um termo vago e apontamos esta ideia mais para o que choca do que é o danoso. Por exemplo, esquecemos, é-nos mais chocante uma manifestação que se incendeia um caixote do lixo do que propriamente um dano de uma fábrica que é danosa para o ambiente, mas ninguém diria que é violenta. Então, numa sociedade que é baseada no patriarcado, no racismo, no colonialismo, o que é chocante é tudo que vai contra isso, não é? Então, ele questiona que métodos é que usamos e quando é que os usamos. Se não deveria ser passado pelo filtro da violência e não violência. E num tempo que há máximo desemprego, se existem os cortes de saúde, óbvio, ele refere também os cortes de saúde por causa desta questão da pandemia. O que é violento? Onde é que está aqui a violência? Se o Estado continua a cortar em certas coisas. E aqui existe a avaliação como é que nós resistimos enquanto população, enquanto indivíduos, enquanto cidadãos ativos da sociedade. Pronto, então será que este método de luta da violência, ao usarmos métodos violentos, reproduz métodos opressivos ou não? Portanto, não se relaciona tanto com a questão da violência. O Peter falou que trabalhou com prisões e que luta por um mundo sem prisões, e não podemos pôr na mesma caixa alguém que tortura uma pessoa e alguém que luta contra o torturador. Portanto, não é a mesma coisa. Não devemos categorizar as pessoas da mesma forma. Portanto, aqui ele questiona qual é que é a eficácia da não-violência. Nós somos educados nesta questão da não-violência pelo Estado. São histórias contadas, e ele, vindo dos Estados Unidos, refere, por exemplo, Hollywood. E então, ele refere aqui a história também que todos nós conhecemos e das lutas de Martin Luther King e outras pessoas que foram igualmente importantes, mas refere Birmingham como a cidade mais segregada do Estado, em que o Martin Luther King teve uma ação pacífica nessa cidade do Sul. Mas o que apagam desta história é que as ações não pacíficas, muitas delas falharam. E o que não falhou, ou o que teve bastante visibilidade, e já agora fazendo aqui um pequeno marketing sobre o assunto, nós temos uma performance que é os Caminhos de Pan, que abordam isso, é que a juventude tomou o centro da cidade numa manifestação e começou a incendiar certos negócios e começou a ter uma certa abordagem violenta, e aí sim começaram a chegar certa visibilidade e reformas, por uma diversidade de táticas, ou seja, não foi só a não violência. Então o governo quer que nós não sejamos violentos e quer que isto seja uma coisa do passado, quer apagar esta história. Pronto, depois falamos aqui da questão da importância do espaço público e de quando as pessoas foram para a rua, e ele referiu a questão de Gandhi também, como é que a não violência de Gandhi historicamente acabou por perpetuar um racismo que acaba ele mesmo por ser mais violento, e referiu também a invasão as manifestações contra a invasão do Iraque em 2003, e como estes protestos não violentos, como todos acharíamos que iriam mudar alguma coisa, mas não aconteceu. E refere também, dentro desta linha, o exemplo do Vietnã, em que as tropas não saíram do Vietnã pelos protestos pacíficos, como nos querem fazer, como a história nos conta e como nos querem fazer acreditar, mas porque os Estados Unidos estavam a perder o controle dos militares, que estavam simplesmente fartos e cansados, e que muitos destes militares, e muitos deles latinos e negros, começaram a ficar radicalizados e começaram a desobedecer aos seus oficiais e inclusive a matar os oficiais. Portanto, e também quando os vietnamitas, obviamente, começaram a resistir. Portanto, foi até esse ponto, até haver uma resposta violenta, que se começou a fazer aqui uma viragem. Portanto, não houve, em 2003, depois desta tentativa de parar a invasão do Iraque, não houve uma continuidade de solidariedade, e a verdade é que ele depois refere agora à questão atual e contemporânea da Catalunha e à presente situação, em que temos uma violência perante pessoas que são evacuadas das suas casas porque não conseguem pagar a renda, onde existe brutalidade policial, onde existem campos de migrantes incendiados. E pronto, e temos o recente caso do rapper, não é, que o mais recente que foi, que está incriminado em tribunal por criticar o rei de Espanha. Portanto, aqui depois ele fala brevemente sobre a questão dos mídia, como é que os mídia abordam esta questão. Se primeiro falam ligeiramente, um bocadinho a favor relativamente aqui à destruição da propriedade, que existe, que é justificável, pode ser justificável, mas depois que se vê uma proximidade entre os mídia e a polícia e a defesa dos mídia pela polícia, e que houve aqui uma questão em que ele refere também a brutalidade policial, que numa destas manifestações, como é que a polícia se comportou e que alvejou uma das pessoas, e que se falou nos mídias sobre esta responsabilidade, em inglês é accountability, a responsabilidade da polícia. Portanto, ao mesmo tempo em que se focou nos mídias perante esta que por certos momentos parecia que se ia tornar o debate, ok, então não é correta a violência que é usada pelo Estado e como é que nós podemos falar sobre isso, no outro voltou-se o diálogo então para a violência perante coisas que não têm objetos, contentores, montras, propriedade, e mais uma vez se esqueceu o diálogo que se deveria estar a ter e o foco que se deveria estar a ter. Portanto, o Peter terminou um bocadinho a dizer que precisamos, entre aspas, partir coisas, partir a submissão e as infraestruturas às vezes, e perceber como é que tomar a rua, como começar, e que o ênfase não deveria ser na violência, mas na opressão e na capacitação. E é neste diálogo que nós nos devíamos focar. E também quem é que torna a vida impossível para os restantes. Portanto, a distração muitas vezes nos mídias e do governo, etc., existe num contentor do lixo que é incendiado, mas as pessoas fazem isso muitas vezes para desviar a atenção da polícia, que porventura as pode atacar ou porventura pode ser violenta para com elas. Pronto, e o próximo passo seria abrir uma conversação social para o que precisamos. Impedir banqueiros, por exemplo, ir para a rua impedir banqueiros de evacuar as pessoas. So it was a marathon, I briefly translated what you said. And I have two things to ask or to add regarding this. And thank you so much, because I think it was a very good summary of everything you talk about in your book, and that is so important. But it's incredible how violence is actually always present in our society, but only in certain moments we focus on it. And I think it's strategically. We only focus on it when it's when it's a matter, when it's interest, when there's this interest, because the rest of the time we are numb towards it, because violence can be silent. We can be oppressed, and oppression is a form of violence. So we forget that, and this is very Portuguese, I believe, that in Portuguese society, I feel that sadness is a noble feeling. So if you feel sad, it's noble. But if you feel enraged, it's like, oh, you shouldn't do that. Like, why are you? We forget that rage is something that moves things forward. I was having a conversation about this with someone, which is a parent, and she was saying that many times we say to our children when they are misbehaving, oh, your behavior makes me so sad. But we don't say, it makes me angry. And sometimes it makes me angry, and it's more honest. So what happens with anger is that it moves things forward versus sadness. So it's also this thing in society, I do believe, that how do we deal with these pulsions which are natural, which we forgot that are also very natural, and that we forgot to interpret. I will just briefly translate. Estava a dizer ao Peter também que, na verdade, a violência está presente em vários momentos na nossa vida, e que a opressão também é uma forma de violência, e o silêncio também é uma forma de violência. E até nas nossas relações parentais, dei o exemplo aqui de uma conversa que tive, que uma mãe dizia que, como a tristeza é um sentimento nobre, e dizemos para os nossos filhos, deixas-me tão triste, mas não dizemos que me deixas zangado. E parece quase como recalcamos isso. E como é que nos esquecemos um pouco desta presença da violência como algo também natural. So I don't know if you want to comment. I also wanted to add on this that I said, but I wanted to add also our political context, and also the fight towards extremism and in far-right movements, which is usually when I think you referred to two things which are many things that are important, but it's the continuation of going to the street, the public space, which we usually forgot, and I think it's delegitimized. I don't know how to say it in English, but é não legitimizado, so it's like forgotten. Okay, now we do we do the fight the other way through social networking, and we forgot the importance of going to the street in this plurality of tactics, and even absurd. And we recently had this case. I was telling Peter before we started. I was telling you before we started about the protest that was in our hometown, Setúbal, small protest against our far-right party, which was completely delegitimized by our media, but also by some left-wing parties. And for me, it was very strange, because it seemed like the people didn't have the right to protest against something that is violence, because if it goes against human rights, and if it's going towards patriarchy, racism, etc., it's very violent. So estava a dar só o exemplo, just briefly translate, estava a dar só o exemplo da questão do protesto que houve em Setúbal relativamente ao Chega, e à forma como os mídias, de certa forma, deslegitimizaram a manifestação, como se fosse algo violento que não aconteceu, mas também que deslegitimizaram a presença no espaço público das pessoas que fizeram este protesto, e até um pouco a esquerda, por vezes. So if you would like to also comment on these two brief things, Peter, if you have something to add.
To the first thing, I'll just add briefly that also anger and taking physical action can be really important for healing from trauma. It's not about like staying in that moment always, but you need that to be able to move through it. So yeah, absolutely.
The other thing is that I would like to add is regarding our perpetual piece, our text, is that Emmanuel at the end, and okay, spoilers to those who haven't read and that will see the show, possibly is one of the characters has a very rhetorical and intellectual approach from beginning to end. It was a fight dog, and then he got the perpetual piece is a metaphor for the society of violence, in how supposedly we want to protect the society, but we end up using very violent means, and we want to protect the society from terrorists, but we end up using more violent means. So where does it end? And the fact is that spoiler alert, Emmanuel at the end doesn't have any choice than to recur to violence anyways. So it's also this Ouroboros that we see ourselves in, and that in the end, what are the options? How do we approach this? And we have to approach it in a critical way, but it's still an answer. What I want to say is that it's still an answer in a valid answer. Eu estava só aqui a contextualizar relativamente à nossa obra, a Paz Perpétua, e fazendo aqui um bocadinho de spoiler a uma das personagens que tem uma posição um bocadinho mais retórica e intelectual desde o início, que é a personagem do Emmanuel, que acaba depois também por recorrer à violência, a Paz Perpétua não deixa de ser uma metáfora sobre esta sociedade de violência que nós vivemos e a proteção contra o terrorismo, mas que acaba por utilizar métodos mais violentos até nesta luta. Peter, I don't know if you want to add something to this conversation, and also regarding the perpetual piece from some ideas.
Yeah, I mean, I think you really summed up one of the problems with anti-terrorism politics that's important to the piece. Well, one thing that I would add is that contradiction. I think, to me, at least on a more analytical level, shows the importance of switching from an analysis of violence or nonviolence to one of authoritarianism and empowerment, because the Ouroboros, the circle without end that you described, I think becomes inevitable the moment you have a structure in society that determines that it has the legitimacy to organize society, to tell society how it needs to live. Because really the whole fight of anti-terrorism it's really a contest between two powers that think in very similar ways, that think in terms of sacrificing those lives will be worth it to preserve our truth. But really, by preserving our truth, I mean imposing their truth on an entire society. So once you go down that road, then it's kind of the outcome is inevitable. And yeah, it's important also for me, if we're thinking about the social dimensions of the play, they were in a closed space, right? They were in a place where it was designed as a test, and there was no way out of it. Even if I'm remembering correctly, there was this one kind of cute moment where two of the characters let's escape. So I think when we're looking at the dynamics of state power, of torture, of imprisonment, we need to find ways to break out and to create our own space to deal with these questions, because the space that we're inhabiting was designed specifically to produce the same outcome over and over and over again.
Sorry,
since yesterday was...
No, go. I was just exchanging windows. I'm sorry.
Okay.
But continue.
Since yesterday was since yesterday was the 8th of March, it could be good to mention like the women's militias in Kurdistan that were instrumental in defeating ISIS as one example of breaking out of the room.
So I will briefly translate it. And it's interesting because we were just coming out, just in terms of curiosity, we were just coming out from a rehearsal. We are starting rehearsals from Animal Farm by Orwell. And we were the end of the rehearsal was talking about enclosures, like this concept of Marx, where in pre-capitalist societies, you started enclosing the land so people didn't get access to it. The principle is the same. You start closing. Like in Virginia Woolf, if we talk about women, she has a rehearsal essay that talks about a room of one's own. So this possibility of having your own space, of being autonomous in being the ruler of your own personal space is very, very important. So, but I will translate what you said. Então, o Peter, só traduzindo aqui brevemente, relativamente à questão que lhe foi questionada da presença sempre da violência na nossa sociedade e de pulsões violentas, ele referiu também a importância desta raiva, às vezes, e até de pulsões violentas para cuidar o trauma. Nos esquecemos um bocadinho disto, muitas vezes a questão do desporto ou de nos pedirem para darmos murros num saco de boxe também é essa, não é? Portanto, e relativamente à peça, à Paz Perpétua, ele faz aqui uma questão, o ponto de ponte com o terrorismo, que é a legitimidade de como é que a sociedade deve viver. E toda a luta antiterrorista é um concurso entre dois poderes que pensam de formas muito semelhantes, tanto o poder do Estado como o poder terrorista. Portanto, quem é que preserva a sua verdade? Portanto, é impor uma verdade geral a uma sociedade inteira. E se pensarmos na dimensão social até da própria peça, existe aqui um espaço fechado, em que eles estão enclausurados, em que todos os cães estão fechados, e não há saída. A certa altura ele refere até, há uma tentativa de saída, os cães pensam em sair, estão a ser, estes cães de luta na Paz Perpétua, há aqui um concurso para ver quem é o escolhido, para detectar os terroristas, e apercebem-se que o jogo está minado. Apercebem-se que afinal eles são um peão deste jogo e tentam sair, mas não têm fuga possível. Portanto, há aqui umas dinâmicas de poder de Estado e de emprisionamento. E ele refere, ontem foi o dia 8 de março, ele refere também aqui a importância das mulheres e das milícias no Kurdistão para lutar contra o ISIS, por exemplo, e a importância destas lutas. Então estamos quase a terminar, estamos a 10 minutos do término, e quem quiser fazer perguntas ou comentários é bem-vindo. Acho que é importante também partilharmos experiências pessoais, locais, nacionais da nossa experiência, mas há aqui uma questão. I was inviting people if they had questions or comments. There is a question here which is regarding if the apology of non-violence isn't just a manipulation to keep a general numbness. So isn't this like appreciation of non-violence just to continue our sleep, let's say?
In a lot of cases, yes. But I mean, to be honest, I've also met practitioners of non-violence who were very sincere and committed. And I definitely would never question their like old left-wing Catholic priests who break onto military bases again and again and again and keep getting sent to prison. I'd never question their sincerity or their commitment. But in society at large, nonviolence I think is just an excuse to at most go to a protest and then just forget about it.
Então, houve aqui uma questão que foi relacionada se não será a apologia da não-violência apenas uma manipulação para manter um estado de dormência geral, e o Peter diz que em muitos casos sim, mas que, por exemplo, tem muitos casos, obviamente, de ativistas e, por exemplo, questões de padres, e sabemos isto, por exemplo, da nossa da nossa ditadura de padres de esquerda, em que nunca questionou, por exemplo, a sua sinceridade e compromisso. E outra das perguntas que me está a surgir, just let me translate this at the same time, se não estará culturalmente incutido o pensamento da não violência, achando que já está na sociedade contemporânea para retirar legitimidade a todos os movimentos que respondem à lógica capitalista neoliberal. Okay, so isn't it already induced culturally in our society? And maybe this is a fact that I was actually researching a little bit beforehand about our Portuguese mentality, but still that if it isn't ingrained in our cultural society, the thought of non-violence, believing already that in our contemporary society, all the movements that will answer it this way and will respond this way to the capital and neoliberal logic will fail to have some degree of legitimacy, let's say. So and the person adds even disobedience and strike as violent and threatening over the media. And now, actually, if we want to make a connection with this strike and disobedience, we can put into context our current situation of pandemics in the state of emergency, where we couldn't, supposedly, striking wasn't allowed. So how the legitimacy, how we can take these things which are basic rights, how they can be forgotten, let's say, in these moments.
Yeah. And there's a cliche that a lot of nonviolence advocates use, which is that, you know, our society is violent, so therefore to be revolutionary, we need to be, you know, nonviolent. Like, that's the thing that's truly different. Although, of course, you know, it's you know, violence above and nonviolence or passivity below. So in the Plaza occupation movement, when that broke out in 2011 here in the Spanish state, like the 15M or Indignados movement, most of those were people who had never participated in a social movement before, and their default belief was nonviolence. So it was very clear that neoliberal society had trained them to believe that nonviolence was what would be effective, and it's what was appropriate. And so, yeah, I think that's true up to a certain point, but eventually, capitalism is just so cannibalistic, it breaks down society to a point where, they keep saying it, but it's kind of obvious that they're also, laughing behind their hands. That, when misery increases so much, it becomes kind of like a silly idea to resist it peacefully. As for strikes, that's very interesting because, I mean, if we look at the history of the labor movement, we can find, some of the greatest stories of revolution and resistance, and also some of the greatest stories of pacification and betrayal and bureaucracy. So in some countries, strikes are just sort of a ritual where, they'll go on a strike for one day and then the union bureaucrats will sign a deal. As for the pandemic, that's interesting because there were actually several factories in the Spanish state, also in the US, where workers forced the companies to adopt safety measures or to take the question seriously. And in some cases, rather than when they were finally forced to acknowledge the pandemic, rather than simply shutting down, on the initiative of workers, they actually repurposed the factories to start building respirators and ventilators. And so that was initially an autonomous action. Or in Spain, one major factor in the end of the dictatorship was the autonomous workers movement. And like this shift from autonomous wildcat strikes to free workers' assemblies to like a major labor union that was being bureaucratized, that was controlled by the Communist Party, and that could call a protest or call a strike and then end it. That's what demonstrated to the fascists that the institutional left had control over this movement. And so, the fascists could, become, right-wing Democrats, and then the communists and socialists could become left-wing Democrats. And so this question of autonomy, of, being able to organize our own struggles in our own spaces is, again, really, really vital.
Respondendo à pergunta e traduzindo um pouco relativamente à questão se não será um bocadinho cultural e mantendo a lógica neoliberal, tentando passar esta não violência. O Peter deu o exemplo dos indignados e do 15M, em que muitas pessoas que participaram nos movimentos não tinham um background tão ativista, e que a sociedade neoliberal os fez acreditar que deveriam ter uma abordagem não violenta. Portanto, e a verdade é essa, é que não houve grande resultado a partir daí. Depois, quanto às greves, é interessante que, por exemplo, funcionam e que os burocratas assinam um acordo quando há greve, é uma coisa comum, mas agora com a questão do Covid, que houve em certos casos houve a reorientação do trabalho, e ele dá um exemplo muito interessante em que e termina a dizer a importância da autonomia, em que o trabalho foi reorientado para produzir, não me lembro qual é a expressão agora, mas os ventiladores, exatamente, em vez de produzirem aquilo que estavam a produzir naquele momento, começou-se a produzir outra coisa para a necessidade do contexto. So we are approaching the end, but I have one final comment or question here. Eu vou ler, I will read it first in Portuguese and then I will translate it in English. Vou ler primeiro em português e depois em inglês. Então, se tu saísses da caverna e queres mostrar aos outros que outra forma de viver é possível, precisas de criar empatia, de construir pontes, de educação, certo? Acho que há muito foco nos problemas e falta de dar exemplos de soluções que já estão a ser postas em práticas e ensaiadas em alguns sítios do nosso país ou do mundo, como o confederalismo democrático em Rojava, Kurdistão sírio. É um assunto proibido nos mídias porque mostra uma verdadeira alternativa num contexto adverso. So I will try to translate this. If you went out of the cave and you want to show the others that another way of living is possible, you need to create empathy, build bridges, education, right? I think there's a focus on the problems in the lack of giving examples or solutions that are already being put into practice and rehearsed in some places of the world or our country, like democratic confederalism in Rojava, Syria's Kurdistan, which is a forbidden subject in the media because it shows a true alternative to an adverse context. So if you would like to comment.
Yeah, I think it's extremely important to also show like our imaginaries, our ideas, our constructive projects just in like thinking about the housing struggle, because I've mentioned evictions. Obviously it's very important to stop an eviction. But connected to that has been a whole movement of taking over empty buildings that belong to the banks and creating collective living situations. Also, in many cases, buy-in for migrants who are undocumented, who wouldn't be able to rent a house in any way. They're able to create housing, and it's kind of both ends of Fortress Europe in Greece. And also in Gran Canaria, like the Canary Islands, or southern Spain and Barcelona, there have been moments where actually these autonomous movements willing to break the law have been doing more to house people without housing like particularly undocumented people than the state. So that's I think like another example of an inspiring. An inspiring project that comes out of our movements.
Então, relativamente a esta pergunta, o Peter referiu a questão das evacuações e da questão da habitação social e como criar habitação, especialmente relativamente a migrantes, não é? Numa fortaleza Europa. E deu o exemplo da Grécia e em Gran Canaria também, em que houve momentos em que grupos autónomos e grupos da sociedade civil e movimentos civis fizeram mais para acolher pessoas e para ajudar pessoas a encontrar habitação do que o Estado. Portanto, está aqui, é outro dos exemplos em que estes bons exemplos, digamos assim, ou soluções da sociedade existem. Let me just see if there's something more before we close. Okay. So there is a question. I will read it first in Portuguese and then in English, and then we close. Se percebi bem, o Peter é anarquista, e a minha pergunta é como viver o anarquismo nesta época em que quase desapareceu. Nesta época de neoliberalismo, capitalismo que destruiu todo este movimento tão importante e que agora é apagado da história. De que modo o anarquismo pode ser importante? De que forma pode lutar? So if we understood correctly, you are an anarchist, and the question is, the person writes, how to live anarchism in this time and age when it's almost gone, or the movement is almost gone. In this time of neoliberalism, capitalism that destroyed this movement so important that is now erased from history. In which way can anarchism be important? In each way can it fight?
It sounds like maybe things are pretty grim in Portugal. I would I would say the movement is growing in places like the US, holding steady in Spain, and growing in other places as well. But yeah. I mean, at every scale and in every place, there are things that we can do, both to resist the onward march of capitalism, of racism, of patriarchy, and to create a different way of living. And so I think one thing that's important about anarchism is the way that it asks those questions, rather than establishing, sort of like a program of like, this is the revolutionary subject, this is the strategy. It asks us to look around us, to inquire what our own needs are, what our possibilities are, and, the needs and desires of those around us, and to form relationships based in solidarity, based in mutual aid, based in struggle. So I've never been to Portugal. I really couldn't presume to say, what someone should be doing in Portugal, but maybe the method to the question is more important than the answer. So, where I live, and, it's a small town outside of Barcelona, I look at, there's questions of, people who need housing and, who are getting evicted. And fortunately, there are groups that are resisting that are occupying blocks. So we can participate in those groups and, bring this anarchist perspective to that kind of activity. There's a lot of rural projects, because it's a small town. There's, a lot of countryside around. There's lots of abandoned olive trees. So for example, I take care of some abandoned olive trees, and, with groups of friends, we cooperatively, harvest these and share the oil, or, other similar projects where we create a network based on mutual aid rather than on money exchange. And so that provides like a model of a different way of doing things, also when it's very ecological, which is obviously extremely important at this time. And it makes survival easier, right? It helps us escape a little bit from the impositions of capitalism in the state. For housing, I squat an apartment. And so these are things that help us create stronger relationships with other people in struggle, and that also make our lives a little bit easier. I mean, obviously, the struggle, you of course bring yourself a lot of headaches too, and there's always going to prison or getting shot at by police. But on like some like deeper level, life is more real, and it's more joyful when you struggle, rather than just kind of let yourself go dead inside and just kind of not look at all the things that are happening.
It's interesting because you were talking, and somehow the idea of theater came in. The theater as a revolutionary act also came into my mind, and the importance of theater as maintaining also these relations in thinking and changing society. Mas I will translate mainly what you said. Estava só a dizer ao Peter que naquilo que ele disse me veio a ideia o teatro, não é? E o teatro também como ajuda mútua, e a importância do teatro para olharmos à nossa volta, mas relativamente à questão feita que o movimento está a crescer, o movimento anarquista nos Estados Unidos e está a aguentar-se em Espanha, portanto ele vê um bocadinho que talvez em Portugal a situação não esteja assim tão boa e está a crescer noutros sítios, mas há sempre coisas a fazer para criar um modo diferente de fazer as coisas. Portanto, tem a ver com a forma como se faz as perguntas, basicamente. A resposta, relativamente ao anarquismo, em vez de ter um programa específico, um ensaio, digamos assim. Então a questão é olharmos à nossa volta, percebemos que problemas é que temos, e aqui a relação com o local parece-me bastante importante, e relações que são baseadas na ajuda mútua e na solidariedade. Ele diz que nunca esteve em Portugal, mas o método à pergunta, ou o método da pergunta é mais importante que a resposta. Ele olha para o seu caso, ele vive ao pé de Barcelona, e há pessoas no sítio onde ele vive que não têm casa e que estão a ser evacuadas. Portanto, isto é um assunto permanente onde ele está. Há sítios a serem ocupados, há squatting a acontecer, e há projetos rurais. Portanto, há oliveiras também que estão a ser, as pessoas estão a aproveitar estas oliveiras abandonadas, a fazer azeite, a apanhar as azeitonas, e é muito baseado, mais uma vez, na ajuda mútua e na ajuda à sobrevivência, tornar a sobrevivência mais fácil. E ajudar, de certa forma, a criar relações mais fortes, que fazem a nossa vida também um pouco mais fácil. Claro que podem acontecer coisas pelo caminho, como ir parar a prisão ou ter ataques com a polícia, mas as relações vão se tornando e tentar encontrar estas soluções. So, last comment, último comentário, last one before we go. Just to add it, Luísa Monteiro refere que temos células ativas da anarquia, trabalham ao nível do pensamento, talvez a elevada abstenção registada nas eleições seja voto dos anarquistas. Algumas são. Okay, so there's a comment that says that we have active cells of anarchism that work at the level of thought, in Portugal, I mean. But maybe that the high level of abstention registered in the elections is from anarchists. There is this comment. I don't know if you want to. It's an idea that gets passed, but I don't know if we have time. But if you want to do a short comment before we leave regarding this.
Sure. Yeah, I wouldn't assume that people who don't vote are anarchists, but of course, it can be that at least they are maybe not as trustful of the state, or not motivated by it. But I think there's possibility to have conversations with a lot of people throughout society about these topics. So,
and I would add actually that the problem of people, of the voting question and the election question is a wider and bigger problem than it's a problem if people believe in this government or what the state is doing or how active are we as citizens. Because what I see from anarchist movements is that they are many times very, very active in interventionist in society. So thank you, Peter. We are at the end of our time. I think as the name goes, as the title of this conversations goes, the idea is to be immediate dialogues. It's just to bring some ideas into the table, and which relates to our text, and also to bring not new ideas, but at least ideas which are not so much talked and to shake a little bit. And I think this topic is very very important to discuss, and I hope that you come to Portugal, that you visit Portugal, that you discuss more these topics, and that you are invited as well for our premiere whenever it happens, hopefully soon. But we would be very happy to have you with us. It's very physical. It's in Portuguese, but it's a very physical way. So the way it's directed by José Maria Dias, it's very physical. So I think even if it's in Portugal, I think you would, in Portuguese, I think you would understand it. And I don't know if you want to add something as a final remark.
Thanks for inviting me, and thanks to everyone who listened.
So, obrigada, acabei de agradecer só a presença, e a ideia destes diálogos é serem realmente diálogos curtos e que abanem um bocadinho, que nos tragam um bocadinho aqui o debate para a mesa de tópicos às vezes que não são assim tão discutidos. O Peter, pronto, acabei de o convidar também para vir ao nosso espetáculo quando ele estiver em cena. Ficam também mais uma vez todos convidados. Esta semana, na quinta-feira, teremos mais um diálogo sobre soft power e hard power, na quinta-feira, e para a semana sobre conflito interno e externo. Na quinta-feira será com a Vanessa Moreira e com a atriz Sara Túlio Costa. Na terça-feira, próxima terça, será sobre conflito interno e externo, com o psicólogo mais sobre a questão psicológica, digamos assim, da importância do conflito ou da relevância do conflito, com o psicólogo Rui Aragão Oliveira, psicoterapeuta, e com o ator Carlos Pereira. E na quinta, ética e estética, com Nuno Dabais e com o ator Fábio Nóbrega Vaz. Obrigada por nos verem, vamos ficar com, e obrigada Peter uma vez mais, vamos ficar com o teaser da Paz Perpétua até à sua estreia. E obrigada a todos os que nos viram e fizeram comentários. Até já. I think we can talk. I think it's